Welcome to the Happier and Healthier podcast. I'm your host, Maria Marlowe, and this is a place where we don't rely on good luck or good genes for our health and happiness, but rather we create it with our thoughts and our actions each and every single day. Each week, I'll bring you a thought or a guest that will help you live your happiest and healthiest life. Are you ready? Welcome back to the Happier and Healthier podcast. Today's episode is all about how to grocery shop like a nutrition pro. So you can go into the grocery store and feel really confident that you're making healthy and good choices and not feel overwhelmed or confused. So as many of you may know, I have a book called The Real Food Grocery Guide, which came out about a year ago, and it was inspired by my grocery store tours, which was a service that I offered for many years, where I would literally take clients all around the grocery store, helping them understand how to pick the healthiest foods in every single aisle of the grocery store. It was even a little bit surprising to me, but it became one of my most popular offerings, and people really loved it and learned a lot from it, which is why I ended up turning it into the book. So today I'm going to be sharing some of the top tips from each of the chapters in the book. But first, let me give you a little background for context. It might seem strange that people would even need a grocery store tour, right? I mean, what could be so hard about going into the grocery store and picking out food? And the problem, I think, is that, in my opinion, not everything sold in the food store is food. There's a lot of items that are just loaded with all sorts of chemicals and ingredients that do more to harm our health than improve it. And my definition of food is supposed to nourish us. It's supposed to support our health and support our body. And if it doesn't do it, then it's not food. Maybe we could eat it, but that doesn't make it food. Now, this is how I feel now, but growing up, I had absolutely no idea. As many of you may know, I grew up eating almost entirely processed and packaged foods. If it didn't come out of the box, I didn't want it, and I really had no idea what fresh vegetables were, nor did I want to go anywhere near them. So I've really done a huge 180, and I totally understand that making the transition from a more standard American diet to a healthier diet can seem a little scary or overwhelming at first, but I promise that it's not so bad, and once you get to the other side, you're gonna actually enjoy it much more. So before we get into the specific tips, I just want to take it back a second and talk a little bit about why there is so much confusion about what's healthy and what's not. When I was growing up, and I'm sure many of you remember this, the food pyramid was the main nutrition guideline, and it was plastered everywhere. Now, I'm sure that I learned about it in school, saw it in school in some gym or a health class, but really where I got very well acquainted with it was on the back of my Cheerios box. And I can so vividly remember every single morning staring at the back of my Cheerios box where this gigantic food pyramid was plastered on the back, and I would literally race to shovel in 2 or 3 bowls of Cheerios with milk, skim milk at the time, or maybe 1%, in order to reach my 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta that the food pyramid advised me to eat. With the food pyramid, I was really able to justify a lot of my processed food choices because it was essentially telling me the biggest food group, or the food I should eat the most of, was this processed grain food or processed carbs, which we now know, it seems funny that anyone would ever recommend that, but that was the guideline really not too long ago. So I was thinking that that was scientifically based, and it turned out that the federal food guidelines and nutrition guidelines are more heavily based on economic and political policies versus actual science. So I didn't know this at the time, but there were a lot of nutrition groups that were giving the pyramid a lot of flack and saying, hey, this doesn't seem to be scientifically sound, you need to change this. And so as we know, over the years, there have been a couple other iterations of the guidelines. The most recent one is now the USDA MyPlate. And MyPlate is definitely a huge improvement. The biggest thing that you'll notice is that now half of your plate is fresh food, fresh vegetables and fruit, instead of refined carbs like bread. You'll notice that the bread is no longer on the MyPlate. And while it is a huge improvement over that original pyramid, it's still not necessarily 100% scientifically sound. And there's still a lot of people in the nutrition space and researchers in the nutrition space who are calling it out and saying, hey, this doesn't seem to be based completely 100% on the latest science. And one of the biggest critics of the MyPlate is actually Harvard School of Public Health. After MyPlate came out, they came up with their own version of a healthy eating plate called the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. They state very clearly that they wanted to put this out into the world because they felt that the USDA guidelines were so clearly economically influenced. So that's part of the reason that there's so much confusion out there, is because there's a lot of conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, the USDA, US Department of Agriculture, they are not necessarily going to be the best ones to create the nutrition guidelines, because they also have to think about US agriculture and what do we grow and how do we make sure that our farmers can stay in business and survive. Whatever we grow or make here ends up being on their version of the guidelines, regardless of whether or not it's healthy. So that's one reason that there's some confusion, because there's a lot of conflicting nutrition information out there. And then on top of that, even more conflicting nutrition information is coming from food producers. A lot of what you think you know about nutrition most likely came from an advertising campaign. So again, when I was growing up, the Got Milk ads were there telling me how dairy is going to make and milk is going to make my bones really, really strong. And if you ask anyone, why do we need calcium? The immediate response is because we need it to build strong bones. But what about magnesium? What about vitamin K? What about vitamin D? There are many other nutrients that we need for strong bones, and calcium is only one piece of that puzzle. Additionally, research has shown that the countries that consume the highest amount of dairy products also tend to have the highest rates of osteoporosis, whereas the countries that consume the least amount of dairy don't have as high levels of osteoporosis. And the paradox is that even though dairy contains calcium, which our body needs and our bones need, it doesn't contain other crucial nutrients that are needed for bone health, and it's high in saturated fat as well as retinol or vitamin A, which at high levels can paradoxically weaken the bones. So you've got the US government giving you nutrition advice, you've got the food industry giving you nutrition advice, and then you also have individual companies that make food products giving you nutrition advice. So for example, the diet soda industry, I can remember very clearly the Britney Spears diet soda ads and all the celebrity soda ads. And you see these celebrities who you idolize and who are thin and beautiful. And you think, okay, if they're drinking it, then I'm sure I'll look like that too if I drink it. But they don't tell you about the research that shows that diet soda drinkers end up gaining more weight and having a higher risk of a cardiac event than non-diet soda drinkers and even regular soda drinkers. So for example, a University of Texas study found that drinking 1 to 2 cans of diet soda a day increases your risk of obesity by almost 55%, compared to only 33% for people who drink the same amount of regular soda. So here they are marketing it as a diet product because it doesn't contain sugar, it contains artificial sweeteners, yet unfortunately artificial sweeteners are associated with weight gain and obesity apparently. So if you're going to drink soda, which I don't recommend, you're better off with the regular soda than you are the diet soda. Diet soda also increases your risk of a cardiac event. So a University of Miami Miller School of Medicine study found that regular consumption of diet soda increases your risk of a cardiac event by 61%. That's pretty major. So again, things are marketed one way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the diet food is going to make you thin and it's going to make you healthy. And in many cases, these types of foods are actually worse for our health. So I just think there's a lot of confusion out there. I know when I was growing up, I was super confused. I mean, when I was on a diet, I thought all I had to do was peel the fried coating off of my chicken nuggets to get to the white meat. I mean, talk about clueless. And I think it's really designed that way. We're not really given a nutrition education in school. We're eating whatever our parents give us, and we're learning our nutrition facts from the TV and magazines and from basically the people who are producing and selling us the food, but we're not given a great understanding of actual real science-based nutrition. So that is why we're confused, and that is why I think we need a guide through the grocery store. And I wrote this book, The Real Food Grocery Guide, because it's something that I wish I had when I was transitioning over to a healthy diet, or better yet, that my parents had, and that they had instilled it into their lives, and that they were eating this way and shopping this way for us as kids growing up, so that it was already sort of in our DNA and already instilled into our lifestyle. But luckily, it's never too late to start. You got to start somewhere, and it's really a treasure trove of everything and anything you could want to know about every aisle of the grocery store. So we'll start in the veggie section, my favorite section of the grocery store, and where I do think the majority of your food should be coming. And, in the book, it really breaks down over 50 different types of produce. And how do you choose the best kind? How do you make sure it's the most nutritious and the ripest and most delicious tasting? But also, what are the health benefits of it? But just in general, I want to give you some sort of overarching tips about questions that I get all the time in terms of produce. So one question that's really common is, do I need to eat organic? And should everything be organic? My opinion is that in an ideal world, everything we eat would be organic. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world, we live in the real world. And in the real world, we're not going to always have access to organic foods, and sometimes they're going to be just way too expensive, which is totally fine. We don't have to consume every single thing organic. There are ways that you can decide what makes sense to eat organic and what maybe is not such a big deal. So first of all, why organic? When we choose organic, we're avoiding toxic and persistent pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and GMOs. Many of the common agricultural chemicals that are used on conventional produce have been linked to serious health concerns, from brain damage to infertility to endocrine complications and even cancer. By choosing organic, you're avoiding or limiting your exposure to these toxic chemicals. Additionally, they're better for the environment, and research shows that organic produce is typically more nutritious than its conventional counterpart. Now, a great tool that you can use to help you decide which foods do you purchase organic and which ones are okay conventional, and that is the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen list and Clean 15 list. This list is put out annually by this organization, the EWG, and what they do is they test pretty much all the basic types of produce for number of chemicals and types of chemicals in the US. And they put them in order of most toxic in terms of most chemicals and most toxic chemicals, all the way to the least toxic. And the Dirty Dozen list is the top 12, and they also, the past 2 years, have extended it a couple with their Dirty Dozen Plus list, because there were more than 12 that they felt we should really avoid based on their research. And this includes things like apples and strawberries, celery, mainly things that have a very thin skin that we eat. So these are things that they advise we should buy organic and consume organic as often as possible, if not always, because on the conventional versions of these foods, they do have very high amounts of pesticide and chemical residue, and the types of chemical residue that we should be worried about that are associated with a lot of health problems. Now, on the flip side, they also have the Clean 15 list, and this is the list of foods that routinely, even in their conventional form, they're not sprayed very heavily, or the types of chemicals that are sprayed on them are not really associated with the same types of health problems. And so in that case, buying them conventional is a great choice. So that's just one way that you can decide what are you going to have organic and what are you going to have not organic, and it'll allow you to save some money there because not everything needs to be organic. Another tip from the veggie chapter is just that you want to also eat a variety of produce. I think it's really easy for us to get into a rut of kind of choosing the same foods, carrots and spinach and mushrooms, and just eating the same things over and over again, but there's really so many different types of produce, and it's a great idea to start rotating things. And so dark leafy greens, they're one of the healthiest foods we can eat, but don't just eat spinach every single day for weeks and weeks and weeks. rotate it. 1 week do spinach, 1 week arugula, Swiss chard, kale, collard greens. There's so many different types. So you want to make sure that you're rotating them, because that's going to ensure that you're getting a wide variety of nutrients, because each of these types of foods are going to have slightly different nutrient profiles. And also making sure that you're avoiding any buildup of toxins. If whatever you're eating does have some sort of toxin in it, you're not just repeatedly adding to your toxin exposure every single time. By rotating and adding variety, you're limiting your exposure to that sort of buildup. The next chapter is all about grains, and when we're choosing grains, I think it's really important to always choose whole grains versus refined grains, meaning brown rice versus brown rice cereal, which is, made from a brown rice flour, let's say, or is puffed, or whole oats like the rolled oats or steel cut oats versus instant oats. Even though these are the same exact foods, whenever we process a grain, or really any carbohydrate for that matter, when we process it, we completely change that food. So take the case of oatmeal. Steel cut oats and instant oats are technically the same thing, right? They came from the same exact place. But the difference between them is that the steel cut oats are going to be higher in nutrients, higher in fiber, higher in protein, and more importantly, lower glycemic than the instant oats. And if you think about them in terms of what they look like, the steel cut oats look like little cylinders and they take about 30 minutes to cook, whereas the instant oats look like sand or powder and they only take a minute to cook. And the reason that they cook so quickly is because they have been broken down and processed so much that they get to that really small size that has a lot of surface area, and that's why it cooks so quickly. And that larger amount of surface area also makes that food higher glycemic. So when you eat a bowl of instant oats, it's going to raise your blood sugar more than if you ate the same amount of steel cut oats. And so that is just one example of why it's really important to choose whole grains like a steel cut oat versus processed and refined grains like an instant type of grain or instant oat. Another thing that I think is really important when it comes to grains is that we avoid gluten. And if you listen to the podcast number 2 with Dr. Pedre, he goes into it a little bit more about why gluten is problematic for everyone, regardless of whether or not you have celiac. So I encourage you to check out that episode, or you could also read more about it in my book. The next chapter is all about legumes, beans, and soy. In my opinion, beans are one of the healthiest foods that we could eat. They're also an especially great food for weight loss because they're super high in fiber and super high in protein. This makes them very satiating. After you have a nice big bowl of beans, you're going to feel full and satisfied for hours and hours and hours. You're not going to feel like you need to eat right again very soon after, like you would if you ate a piece of bread or a croissant or a dessert. So they're very satiating. They're also incredibly nutritious and typically have a large amount of iron, calcium, magnesium, various minerals, the B vitamins, and they also have a variety of antioxidants that are unique to them. So I just think that they're a great food to include in the diet. Now, I do just want to quickly address the paleo argument that humans should not eat beans, because I think that it's flawed, and I discuss this more in depth in my book and have a lot of research to back it up. But in short, the argument from the paleo side is that beans are not meant to be eaten because 1, our Paleolithic ancestors didn't eat them, and 2, because they contain anti-nutrients like lectins and phytic acid. Now, the first argument is false. Archaeologists have found beans and legumes in the bodies of our Paleolithic ancestors. And the second one is true, but that doesn't necessarily make them bad to eat. You soak them in water overnight for at least 8 hours. You drain that water and then you cook them again for a few hours, or you can use a pressure cooker as well. I prefer the pressure cooker personally. When you cook beans for all of these hours or in the pressure cooker, you are significantly reducing the amount of lectins. So because of that, I don't think that lectins are a huge problem. There are many foods that contain lectins. And then the other main concern is the phytic acid, and paleo proponents argue that we can't digest it, and then it binds to minerals and then prevents us from absorbing them. And while this is true, it isn't the whole picture. So while human cells may not be able to break down phytic acid, our gut bacteria can. On top of that, additional research shows that phytic acid acts as an antioxidant, it prevents the accumulation of heavy metals in the body, and it also plays a role in cellular communication. So it may not be such a bad thing after all. On top of that, many vegetables, including things like spinach and Swiss chard, as well as dark chocolate, contain 2 and 3 times the amount of phytic acid as legumes. And these foods are allowed on the paleo diet, so this is a pretty weak argument there. Many cultures all over the world eat beans and legumes, and we've been eating them for centuries, so I really don't think that they're that problematic. Now, if you do find that you have trouble digesting them, then that's probably a tip-off that your digestive system just isn't used to processing so much fiber, in which case I highly recommend taking a high-quality probiotic, which could help with that. Now, personally, my favorite and preferred brand is Hyperbiotics. It's something that I use personally and I recommend to all my clients, and they've also seen amazing results from a flatter stomach to less bloating and improved digestion, more regularity. So it's just highly effective. They use 15 different human probiotic strains as opposed to soil-based organisms, which a lot of the other probiotics use. I found them to be, in my own personal experience and in my clients' experience, the most effective probiotics on the market. I even did a little personal case study with a before and after on my site, so you could check that out, mariamarlowe.com/blog, and then just in the search bar you could type in hyperbiotics or probiotics and it will come up, so you could read more there. And if you're interested in trying them, you can find them on hyperbiotics.com, and you can use the code HYPERMARIA, all one word, for 20% off your order. Next, moving on to nuts and seeds. So in this chapter, we talk all about the health benefits of them, which ones you want to buy versus which ones you want to avoid, aka the roasted salted kind, those are the ones you want to stay away from, the natural raw kind, and the sprouted kind, those are the way to go. Now, the biggest thing that I like to point out in this chapter is that while nuts and seeds do have a lot of calories and they do have a lot of fat, they are still a healthy part of the diet. One of the biggest concepts throughout the entire book is that not all calories are created equal. And I think you can understand that if we just think about 100 calories of Oreos versus 100 calories of an apple or an avocado. And while yes, they are the same amount of calories, they're not going to do the same exact thing in your body. And one is going to satiate you more, it's going to give you nutrients and healthy fat and protein and fiber and vitamins and things that you need, and the other is just going to taste really good going down. It's probably going to give you a sugar high. It's going to spike your blood sugar. It's not really going to fill you up. You're going to be hungry very soon after, and it's just metabolized very differently. So as you can see, not all calories are created the same. Therefore, when it comes to nuts and seeds, we can't just stay fixated on the grams of fat or the number of calories. It's not a complete picture. So often I think people are just terrified that almonds or nuts and seeds in general are going to make them gain weight. But again and again, the research shows that people who eat nuts and seeds, and I'm talking about like raw nuts and seeds, not the roasted, salted kind, they tend to have a lower weight. They tend to be able to lose weight more easily than those who don't include them in the diet. So if you're interested in the research and digging a little deeper, you could check that out in the book. Otherwise, just know that nuts and seeds are a healthy part of the diet. I will say hemp seeds are probably my favorite seed, and if you don't currently eat them, I highly recommend you do. They're incredibly healthy. They're a great source of complete plant-based protein, and they're delicious. Some of the reasons that I really like to include them on the regular, every day almost, is that they contain omega-3, which is an essential omega fatty acid, and it's anti-inflammatory. So we do want to make sure that we're getting plenty of omega-3s and anti-inflammatory foods. It's the source of complete plant-based protein, and it's easy to digest. So I love adding just 3 tablespoons of hemp seeds into a smoothie as my protein powder. So in place of protein powder, just 3 tablespoons of hemp seeds, and that's a great way to get 10 grams of protein. They also contain iron and other minerals that we need. So hemp, I think, is my favorite seed, and if you don't currently eat it, I do highly recommend adding it to the diet. All right, so that was the plant-based section of the book. Now we're going to move into the animal-based chapters, and the first one is for meat and poultry. Now, the biggest tip or takeaway that I can give you from this entire section is that when it comes to any sort of animal products, whether it's meat, whether it's dairy, whether it's eggs, always choose organic. Unlike produce, where I think that you can kind of go either way depending on what it is, when it comes to animal products, always choose organic. And here's why. Organic meat comes from animals that have not been given artificial growth hormones or antibiotics, which may be the most important reason to choose organic meat always. Certain hormones have been linked to cancer, and the frequent consumption of antibiotics has been linked to antibiotic resistance. And antibiotic resistance is going to be a big problem in the coming years, and a lot of the major health organizations are preparing for it and trying to prevent it, but unfortunately, it's still underway because the way that conventional animals are raised is that they're typically given subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics in order to fatten them up. So farmers are paid by the weight, by the pound of the meat. They're not paid by the quality of it. And so, of course, they want the heaviest animal possible. And feeding them subtherapeutic or small amounts of antibiotics on a regular basis helps fatten them up. We are then eating those animals that have been raised on antibiotics. And what's happening is this is breeding antibiotic resistance, which means that certain bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. Antibiotic-resistant infections are currently on the rise. They now kill about 700,000 people globally each year, and that death toll is expected to rise significantly if we continue the way that we're going. Now, the UK's Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, ranked antibiotic-resistant bacteria as serious a threat to society as climate change. And she said, quote, "Antimicrobial resistance poses a catastrophic threat. If we don't act now, any one of us could go into a hospital in 20 years for minor surgery and die because of an ordinary infection that can't be treated by antibiotics. Routine operations like hip replacements or organ transplants could be deadly because of the risk of infection." So I think the whole antibiotic reason is one of the biggest reasons to choose organic. Beyond organic, you also want to look for words like pasture-raised or grass-fed for beef. For chicken, you want to look for things like free-range and pasture-raised, because that's going to mean that the animal had a more natural lifestyle. And typically when an animal is given its natural diet and when it has a more natural lifestyle where it's allowed to walk around and get sun and get grass, then it's going to be a healthier animal and therefore a more nutritious animal as well. So those are just a few of the reasons to choose organic when it comes to meat and poultry. The next chapter is all about seafood, and it goes into the different types of seafood in terms of how they're caught, because how they're caught or how they're raised does make a big difference in the healthiness of the fish. The healthiest and easiest type of seafood to find would be wild seafood. And now it's not wild in the sense that it's caught by a fisherman out on open waters with a fishing line, but rather these types of fish are grown and raised in wild fisheries that are set up within natural bodies of water, such as rivers or lakes or oceans. Unlike farmed fish, wild fish are not given antibiotics or hormones, vaccines, pesticides, none of that stuff. And research also shows that they tend to be more nutritious than their farmed counterparts. So wild makes a great choice. If you can find line caught or pole caught fish, that's even better. They are a little bit harder to find. Usually if you live in a coastal area, they'll be easier to find, but if you live inland, they're probably going to be a little bit harder to find. So wild is still a great choice. Another tip from the book that is really important to keep in mind when it comes to seafood is that you do want to be cognizant of the mercury levels of the different types of seafood, because some types of fish are going to be much higher in mercury and PCBs, which is a toxin, than other fish. If you're eating fish that are typically highly contaminated and you eat them often, it is possible to get mercury poisoning, and it is possible to have very high levels of PCBs, which are both things that you don't want. And unfortunately, in New York especially, where everyone's going out to sushi multiple times a week, I know countless people, I can't even tell you how many people I know, clients, friends even, who have mercury poisoning because they eat so much tuna and so much sushi and so much seafood. So you do just want to be cognizant of what types of seafood you're eating and what their mercury levels are. There's a whole guide in the book that tells you the best types of fish to the worst types of fish and the levels of mercury in each of these types of food. Definitely when it comes to seafood and animal food in general, quality is key. I cannot stress that enough. The next chapter is all about eggs, and egg cartons may be some of the most confusing food packages in the grocery store because there are seemingly dozens of terms on the front of them and claims on the front of them, so it can be a little bit overwhelming just trying to choose your eggs. You would think it's simple, but you see words like pasture-raised, free-range, cage-free, vegetarian-fed, omega-3 enriched. There's just so many terms on egg cartons. So in terms of what you really want to look for, the two key things for choosing eggs, in my opinion, are one, that you want to choose organic, and then two, that you want to choose pasture-raised or free-range, which is going to indicate that the hen had a more natural lifestyle and a more natural diet. When it's raised this way, it's typically going to be healthier, which makes it more nutritious for you as well. All right, the last section of the book, it's about 6 or 7 chapters, is all about packaged foods and how do you choose the best packaged foods, again, in every single aisle. Now, I'm not going to go into each of these specifically, but what I will talk about is the number one most important thing that applies to all packaged foods. And that is, you want to get into the habit of reading labels. Not once in a while, not sometimes, but every time you pick up a packaged food, you want to look at the ingredient list. Now, most people are trained to look at the nutrition facts panel, but that is really not the best indicator of the healthiness of a food. The ingredient list is going to be a much better indicator because then you know where those calories are coming from, where that fat is coming from, where that sugar is coming from. And that is going to be infinitely more helpful in deciding, is this food a healthy food or not a healthy food? First and foremost, I would avoid foods with ingredients that you wouldn't stock individually in your own kitchen. I think oftentimes people will say things like, don't buy ingredients that you can't pronounce, but you can pronounce things like high fructose corn syrup or yellow number 5, and that doesn't mean that you should eat them just because you can pronounce them. You also want to avoid foods that list sugar as the first or second ingredient or that are just loaded with sugar. And there's a lot of sneaky sugar in places that you wouldn't imagine. So obviously it's going to be in cookies and cakes and desserts, but it's also in tomato sauce and salad dressing and bread and all of these savory foods that you wouldn't think have sugar. Many times manufacturers will add sugar to them. Not every brand, and that's why you really need to get into the habit of reading ingredient lists, because then you can see which brands include it and which ones don't. Another important tip here is you also want to avoid any foods with hydrogenated oils. Hydrogenated oils are a short tip-off that the food contains trans fat, and there are some loopholes that allow a package to say 0-gram trans fat even when it contains a hydrogenated oil. So if it contains less than 0.5 grams of trans fat per serving, manufacturers are allowed to round that down to 0. So you think that there's 0, but there's actually 0.5 grams, and hydrogenated oils are very unhealthy. They're eventually going to be phased out of the food supply, luckily, but until that point, it's up to us to avoid them and to look out for them. So you definitely want to avoid hydrogenated oils in the ingredient list. So those are some of my top tips from the Real Food Grocery Guide. This book was 3 years in the making and a ton of research went into it. And I really tried to make it as practical and actionable as possible. After years of coaching clients one-on-one and doing group classes and taking people on grocery store tours, I noticed a lot of the same questions were coming up. So whatever questions that I got from my people, I included in this book. And so I think you'll find that it probably answers 99.9% of the questions you have and 100% of the questions you didn't even know you had. There's a lot of info in here, but I really did make it as practical and actionable as possible. So I hope you learned a few things in this episode. And if you want more information on how to choose the healthiest foods in every aisle, you can definitely check out the book. It's on Amazon, it's in bookstores. Amazon's probably your best bet. It's called The Real Food Grocery Guide. And if you do purchase it, make sure you head to my website, mariamarlowe.com. And on the homepage, you'll see there's actually 2 free PDF downloads for the book. One is my brand picks guide, and the other is a guide to spices and superfoods. So these are, if you purchase the book, these are completely free downloads and they're so valuable. The brand picks guide is literally my favorite brands for pretty much every packaged food, from snack foods to desserts to oils to hummus to whatever. So there I kind of did the homework for you and checked all the ingredient list and also taste tested these foods. So these are some of the staple foods that I keep in my own kitchen. The second free download is my guide to spices and superfoods. It's really one of my favorite chapters because I think spices are the ultimate food as medicine. They're incredibly healing, and they're also a great tool to have in your kitchen, to have a variety of spices, because you just need a pinch of spice and it completely changes the flavor of a dish and makes it infinitely more delicious. So I think that having a very varied spice cabinet is a great idea, and this guide really goes into the different types of spices and the flavors and why you want to eat them. You can head to mariamarlowe.com/podcast and click on this episode, and I'll have all the show notes for today's episode, as well as the links to the book and to the free downloads. Thanks for tuning in this week. If you enjoyed and got value from this episode, I'd be so grateful if you can take just 1 minute to leave an honest review on iTunes, as that will help us reach more people and get incredible guests on the show. To say thank you, email a screenshot of your review to info@mariamarlowe.com and we'll send you a free 3-day healthy eating sugar detox meal plan. After each and every episode, I encourage you to come say hi on Instagram @Maria Marlowe, that's MariaMarlowe, or in the private Happier and Healthier podcast group on Facebook. In both of these places, we can continue the conversation about today's episode, so come and share what you think. If you want more, you can also head to mariamarlowe.com, where you'll find tons of healthy recipes, meal plans, and resources to help you live your healthiest and happiest life. Lastly, if there's someone you know who'd enjoy this podcast, make their day, and mine, and send it to them now. Until next time, don't forget, health and happiness are a choice. Our thoughts become our reality, so make sure you're thinking up a masterpiece.